Imagine that you are convicted of a crime and the central piece of evidence against you is not physical evidence or even an eyewitness. Imagine that the best the prosecution could come up with is an inmate you met in jail while waiting for your trial who falsely tells the authorities that you confessed to committing the crime when you did no such thing. Even worse, this informant or snitch is being paid thousands of dollars or given leniency on his sentence for this testimony. This video lesson is on the systemic cause of the jailhouse rat.
Jack Sagan was one of many children born into a large Italian family in Monterey, California. In 1985, Paula DeRocher was murdered in her apartment in Monterey. There were no witnesses. Jack was implicated in this crime because two jailhouse informants, several months after the crime, told law enforcement that Jack Sagan, who was in custody at that time for an unrelated burglary, had confessed to killing Paula DeRocher in her apartment several months earlier. He went to trial. The jury convicted Jack.
I said, "Judge, you're making a big mistake. I did not kill that woman." He looked dead at me and told me, "That could be."
Jailhouse informants are motivated by their own self-interest to fabricate something that another inmate did something in order to obtain benefits for themselves.
Jack fought and fought and fought, and eventually when we became involved, we realized that DNA testing was what needed to happen in this case. And the result of that testing was that Jack Sagan's DNA was completely absent from a crime scene that was covered in the DNA of many other people. On October 11th, 2019, Jack walked out of Donovan State Prison a free man. He just wanted everybody to know that he didn't do it, and he wanted the person who actually killed Paula DeRocher to be found and to be held responsible for the crime. Unfortunately, in December of 2020, Jack Sagan died of COVID-19.
I just couldn't believe it. I couldn't believe that they convicted me for a murder I didn't even do. Never knew this woman, never met this woman. And these two informants, they used me.
When DNA came about in our system, that's when we really started to figure out patterns in our system that led to wrongful convictions. That was like the most solid proof that we are convicting innocent people. And one of the things it unveiled was the use of jailhouse informants. And in 1989, Los Angeles County was at the heart of this giant informant scandal. And one of the informants did this expose on 60 Minutes and demonstrated how easy it was for him to fabricate a confession by an inmate. That was back in 1989. And jailhouse informants are still used to this day.
Jack Sagan was a good human being. He was a dad, he was a brother. He was a lot of things to a lot of different people. And the jailhouse informants destroyed his ability to continue to have those relationships with his loved ones.
If AB 679 existed back in 1986 when Jack was convicted, those two jailhouse informants would not be testifying, which meant that law enforcement could not rely on them to prove their case, which means we would hope that law enforcement would realize they were going down the wrong path and their investigation would have shifted to the right path, which would have led to the right person who committed that crime and not Jack.
Jack Sagan.
As one judge has said, and I quote, "Jailhouse informants comprise the most deceitful and deceptive group of witnesses known to frequent the courts. The more notorious the case, the greater the number of prospective informants. They rush to testify like vultures to rotting flesh and sharks to blood. They are smooth and convincing liars." End of quote. Historically, at common law, no person previously convicted of a serious crime was in fact eligible to testify in court. This rule was based on two assumptions. One, such witnesses were incapable of telling the truth, and two, juries were incapable of recognizing why. This rule has changed over time and has now been replaced by a practice developed to simply warn a jury that the testimony of a witness with an unsavory or criminal record ought to be examined with great caution. Let's take a look at the famous wrongful conviction in Winnipeg involving the accused Thomas Sofino and the testimony of 3 jailhouse snitches who provided an alleged confession that was totally false. The first informant, Thomas Chang, provided a confession. It came out of his single most important reason for testifying being that he wanted to get out of jail at any cost and to have his charges dropped. The prosecution made this deal, but did not disclose it to the defense. Another snitch by the name of McQuaid likewise provided a confession ostensibly given by Sofino. At the time McQuaid was providing this testimony, he was already involved in 5 other cases where he was likewise providing this type of evidence. McQuaid was in fact well known to the Winnipeg police as an informant. Again, this information was not passed along to the defense. And lastly, the third jailhouse informant, Douglas Martin, was actually verified by a sergeant in the Winnipeg Police Service as a credible witness and that his testimony should be believed. At a subsequent inquiry into this wrongful conviction case, it was said that Martin, and I quote, "seems to have heard more confessions than many dedicated priests. He has testified as a jailhouse informant in at least 9 cases in Canada, and the police knew he had a significant record, including a conviction for perjury," end of quote. And yet, the prosecution put him on the stand for the purpose of convicting an innocent man. Thomas Sofino spent almost 4 years in prison before he was eventually exonerated. It's interesting to look at the context in the United States within which the testimony of snitches is actually encouraged. In America, the provisions for parole are very limited, and in most cases, prisoners must serve 85% of their sentence. The only relief from that rather severe position is Rule 35 of the Federal Rules of Criminal Procedure. The rule sets out that within 1 year after the imposition of a sentence, an inmate can apply for a reduction in that sentence to reflect their substantial assistance to the investigation or prosecution of another person. As such, the provision of confessions by jailhouse snitches is not only openly permitted, but actively pursued. In Canada, as noted, the law has changed from disallowing any testimony by persons with serious criminal records to allowing that testimony, but only with the judge giving a cautionary warning to the jury. The essence of the warning is that when testimony is offered by a jailhouse informant, the judge should provide the jury with a clear and sharp warning about the reliability of the testimony about to be given. The caution should indicate that it is dangerous to convict on unconfirmed evidence of this sort. Of the DNA exonerations in the USA on record, almost 1 in 5 cases involve this type of spurious and highly suspect evidence. Surely, if this is the best the prosecution can do, perhaps it is appropriate to start looking for signs of innocence rather than mechanisms to manufacture guilt. Our next video lesson will be on ineffective counsel.